The development of geopolitics in Japan is in some ways a reflection of the development of geopolitics in Germany. Karl Haushofer spent 2 years in Japan, a country which he admired greatly and which had an important influence on his thinking. I find it interesting that he's remembered there today. If you're a fan of anime, then you'll find his character in the Prisoner of Shambhala episode of Full Metal Alchemist. After returning to Germany, Haushofer wrote Dai Nihon, or Great Japan, published in 1913. His interest in Japan was not only a personal one, but also a strategic one. He felt that an alliance with Japan might balance British power. Herwig explains what this means. In Haushofer's view, a German-Russian combination, the pivotal heartland, might be able, in conjunction with Japan, to control first the inner crescent of British sea power and finally the outer crescent of continental islands. Now, what are these pivots, heartlands and crescents Herwig is referring to? Well, they're all terms taken from Mackinder's Geographical Pivot of History. Originally given as a lecture to the Royal Geographical Society in 1903 and published in the Geographical Journal in 1904. In it, Mackinder presents his natural seats of power and divides the world into the continental pivot area, the oceanic outer crescent and the mixed inner crescent. There's much in the pivot that's still useful, but in many ways geographers have moved beyond it and its strong determinism. Sadly, many authors on war and geography have not. But anyway, back to Japan. The actual first usage of the term geopolitics in Japanese literature occurs in 1925 as a result of Fujisawa Chikao's review of Rudolf Kjellen's work. The German term Geopolitik was originally translated as Jisai Jigaku, or geographical politics. By the 1930s it had been replaced with the simpler Jisai Gaku, which is much closer to geopolitics. Originally the idea was quite unpopular. Writing in 1927, Sasaki says, "I think that those German geopoliticians tend to relate politics to land directly as causality. Since they neglect economic processes which exist between land and politics, I'm afraid that they may well make serious mistakes on theory in the future. I would like them to establish the basis of their geopolitics firmly within geographical perspectives." I find this criticism hugely interesting. Think back to Morgenthau's 1978 description of geopolitics as a pseudoscience erecting the factor of geography into an absolute that's supposed to determine the power and hence the fate of nations. Well, Sasaki is making a very similar argument to Morgenthau, only he's doing it over 50 years earlier, and importantly, he's doing it before geopolitics was completely discredited by the Second World War. But Sasaki's taking it a step further. I would like them to establish the basis of their geopolitics firmly within geographical perspectives. Just 2 years after the term appears in Japan, Sasaki is realizing that there isn't much geography in geopolitics. This is a finding that's lost on some scholars in the Anglosphere almost a century later. Sadly, the Haushoferian style of German geopolitics eventually gains traction in Japan. Parts of the reason for this is that Haushofer's journal, Zeitschrift für Geopolitik, becomes available in Japan. For some authors, the idea of Lebensraum, translated as Saikatsuken, seemed appropriate to Japan. Some attempts were made to inject a moral element into this Saikatsuken theory. The case is made that Japan had seen increasing trade with Southeast Asia in the Meiji period, but Southeast Asia was regarded as neither East, Toyo, or West, Saiyo. Instead it was the hinterland of Nanyo. Geopolitics was used then to try to cement the idea of a Greater East Asia as a geographical inevitability. Fukushima explains this way of thinking. Greater East Asia should forge a single community in view of geopolitics, and for this purpose we should fight to emancipate our Asian compatriots from the control of the West and to establish stability and eternal peace in Asia. Saikatsuken, or Lebensraum then, was seen as emancipatory. Other authors weren't too concerned with this pseudo-moral element and preferred the simple environmental determinism that German geopolitics offered. As Takeuchi tells us, they based their argument on the recognition that Germany was fundamentally in a similar position internationally to that of Japan. Hence, the theories of German geopolitics, especially that of Lebensraum, were valid for Japan. They also intended to apply the concept of spatial planning, Raumordnung, to interior Japan, and especially to the Japanese colonies of Manchuria, Korea, and Formosa. As a result, geopolitics starts to justify expansionism. Narangoa tells us that Japan's interest in the Mongol lands was spurred by general strategic, economic and ideological reasons, and was justified by an academic discourse on geopolitics very much in fashion in the 1930s. It doesn't happen very often, but this is the danger that academics can face when their research is used by the policy community. There are still examples of it today. So, while the earliest forms of German geopolitics in Japan were treated with skepticism, it eventually becomes more dominant, and this German geopolitics forms one half of the Japanese approach to geopolitics in the run-up to the Second World War. Geography the world over is divided into two main parts, physical and human. This division was all the more clear in Japan, as in universities in the east of Japan, geography usually lived in natural science faculties, so tended to be physical, while in the west of Japan, geography was housed in faculties of literature, so was usually human. This led to two distinct branches of geopolitics, the Tokyo School and the Kyoto School. The Tokyo School was driven by the physical determinism of German geopolitics, and many of its members joined the Japanese Society for Geopolitics, founded in 1941. For them, imperial expansion on the Asian mainland and in the Pacific were strategic and economic necessities. The Kyoto School, however, rejected the German form of geopolitics, instead aiming to develop a native Japanese version. Writing in 1940, Komaki said that Japanese geopolitics is different from the many world geopolitical currents imitating German geopolitics, from the colonialist in the British style and also from the old-fashioned type of Chinese geopolitics. It is a distinctively Japanese type, which has existed since the beginnings of the imperial family and will develop in line with the prosperity of the imperial family as a truly creative science of Japan. Writing 2 years later, he goes on to say that we need to establish the new geography which aims to rebuild the world and make it as it originally should be. We can realise the ideal world not by the Western-style geography established on individualism, but by this new geography based on Tennoism. Tennoism is basically the belief that the Japanese emperor is descended from the Shinto goddess Amaterasu, and as such has a divine right to rule. So, we get two schools of Japanese geopolitics, one based on the physical determinism of German geopolitics, and another which tries to overcome the physical German deterministic geopolitics, but instead bases it on the divine superiority of the Japanese emperor. After the disasters of the Second World War, Japanese geographers looked back on both schools of geopolitics and saw them as a pseudoscience to rationalize Japanese imperial policy. Japanese geopolitics, like German geopolitics, made the mistake of mixing theory with political ideology. This is perhaps the most important lesson for geopolitical researchers in the rest of the world for today. In order for geopolitics to claim to be an objective, scientific discipline, it not only needs to develop a coherent theory, but it also needs to make sure it's not carrying any political baggage. Sadly, too few researchers acknowledge this. However, geographers in France have reclaimed the term geopolitics and started using it in new ways. We'll be looking at this reclaiming and how this results in new forms of geopolitics in the next sessions as we continue to try to understand the relationship between war and geography.